Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the mid-year edition of LitFestx. We're on our inaugural session, and we are joined by Mr. Duncan Clark, head of BDA China, a prominent businessman, investment banker, investor, advisor, and he's the author of the best-selling book, "The House That Alibaba Built," which is the story of Jack Ma. Today, Duncan's discussing with us on entrepreneurship, ambition, and everything that goes along with that journey of grits and guts and maybe glory. But Duncan, welcome to LitFestx.
Thanks very much. Good to talk to you all today.
So, Duncan, at the outset, let me ask you: you're somebody who's working across Europe, UK, and China, and in what you do, you're obviously seeing entrepreneurs very closely, and investors, and various startups. What is it that is the key traits that you have observed amongst successful entrepreneurs or in the current environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. How do we make innovation and how do we make entrepreneurs? Well, entrepreneurs really make themselves. And interestingly, when Jack talks about some of his peers in China, he always makes a big distinction in terms of wealthy people in China to single out those that are self-made versus those who perhaps had a helping hand from government or perhaps rich families. Of course, China is interesting in that everything was effectively reduced to a level playing field with the Cultural Revolution and so on. And Jack was born between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So he's perhaps older than some of the tech entrepreneurs that we think of in Silicon Valley. But in terms of somebody of his scale, he is relatively young for somebody who's made such a big impact on China. So I would say the hunger and drive. And in Jack Ma's case, I think being underestimated has been key to his success. And many times people had dismissed him because he didn't, frankly, have the right backgrounds, connections, money, etc. That's not always true for some of the others. If you think about people like Jeff Bezos, who went to Princeton, or Mark Zuckerberg at Harvard, famously, maybe they dropped out, but they dropped out of a very famous institution. So there is an interesting spectrum of experience amongst these entrepreneurs, both in terms of academic background, also what they studied. I mean, Jack famously was an English teacher, so he didn't have the tech skills, and he's an outlier in that sense. But there are some common elements of ambition and vision, which I think how those came to be for each of these individuals is different, but those are common elements for sure.
And how long did you take to research and learn about the entire Alibaba phenomena, if I can call it? Clearly, Jack, did several things right to be able to grow the entire e-commerce marketplace in China and then take it global. So I'm sure your process of research and fact finding would have been very interesting. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I guess accidentally I was sort of there in a way. So primary research is always the best, with your own experience. And I had left here in London and moved to Hong Kong in '93, and then actually set up my company BDA in Beijing in '94, thinking I was moving there for the opening of the telecom market to Western companies. We did the same thing in India, actually. In both cases, we didn't see the big opening that we quite expected. But it was really the technology that the telecom revolution brought in the '90s to China that lay the groundwork for individuals like Jack to emerge. But that wasn't really the internet came to China in '94, but it wasn't really for another decade that we started to see the real impact of the internet taking hold. Jack founded his company in 1999. So I'd already lived in Beijing for 5 years at that point. But that was actually his third company. Jack first had a business as a translator And then he did see the internet himself in '95 when I was living in Beijing. He was in Seattle and experienced the internet for the first time. He visited there. And so you could sort of see, the potential perhaps of the internet in the US, but it was very hard to imagine it for China. So I was there already sort of doing the spade work, if you will, helping on telecom financing and so on. But nobody could have anticipated the scale, of course, of what the internet meant. And it was really, I think, that combination of the internet coming to China and surprisingly coming to China, and the private sector sort of entrepreneurial zeal of people like Jack and his home province, actually, of Zhejiang, eastern China, near Shanghai. Those two things coming together created this explosion of particularly connecting the world to China, the made in China story through the internet. That really was the cocktail that describes how it came together. But Jack had a very early vision of how this would play out, and people thought he was crazy, and he liked to be called Crazy Jack, actually, because it did seem impossible at the time. So he's had a consistent vision for what he wanted to achieve, but I don't think even he could have realized the scale on which it would take place.
You mentioned something interesting about the craziness, so tell us a little more. I mean, clearly there's been some negative news flow of late as well around Alibaba. So should one say that the craziness is on both sides? I mean, it swings both ways, or what's your sort of view?
Well, Jack's never out of the headlines. I should say I worked there briefly as a consultant in 2000 actually, but was always a little hesitant, because he is such a magnanimous personality, and he's great fun to be around, and he says these crazy things, but you always have to have a sense of disbelief. I had my own company, so I sort of hesitated to sort of jump fully in. That was obviously a silly mistake. But I think to this day that people excited to hear from him and be around him, particularly his employees and partners. But there is a degree of skepticism there amongst investors still. You point out recently, yes, there have been some controversies. There's an ongoing SEC investigation into how they account, particularly for their logistics operations. But there are there's always been times when Jack has relished that attention. In fact, even last week, he said, if you want to learn more about Alibaba, sue me. It's a great way to understand my business. And he's extremely confident. And even a few weeks ago, around the issue of fakes, fake products, and that do make their way onto Alibaba's platforms, as they do, frankly, on Amazon and others. He said, well, the fakes in China are sometimes better than the real thing. I mean, he wasn't saying necessarily we want to sell fakes, but he was saying the quality of these factories, some of them making in extra shifts the same products effectively, is so good that it's hard to distinguish. So he's very interesting to write about in terms of my research, because he says things that you don't expect business leaders to say about their own company. He's a bit of a loose cannon, but that's just part of who he is. And around him now, of course, there's a big team trying to kind of tone down, interpret, crystallize what he was saying into more kind of corporate speak. But he shoots from the hip.
Right. Duncan, clearly, one can say that the entrepreneurship model, especially in China, can be termed quite different than, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon model, right?
Yeah.
And what has been your experience? I mean, not just with Jack Ma, but with many other Chinese entrepreneurs that you would have worked with. What's been your experience in terms of what is driving them? How is this entire business of entrepreneurship, if one can call it, how is that evolving in China? And where do you see the global repercussions as some of these entrepreneurs take to the global stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there has been entrepreneurship in China for decades already, but it was really only with the internet that we started to see scaled national businesses and now global businesses emerging. So, for example, when I moved to Beijing in the early mid-90s, there were still there were restaurants, there were small businesses and so on, but they were very small scale, and very few were outside of their home city or province. So the internet obviously helped connect these businesses also with customers and also with capital. So there's a very large today, almost probably too much money sloshing around China looking to back entrepreneurs today. Entrepreneurs themselves now are backing the next generation or the next generation of ventures. So there's capital, there's connectivity that lacked before. But if you look at the entrepreneurial geography of China, I think you can look, surprisingly, Hangzhou and Shenzhen, which is just across the border from Hong Kong, are arguably, I think, the most exciting places today. Beijing remains a very important center, and the early internet players all effectively had to have a big presence in Beijing. But I think what Jack represents, as I describe in the book, is this entrepreneurial mecca, if you will, of Zhejiang province, where tons of small and medium-sized enterprises are formed every day. Every family effectively is engaged in their own business. I think there's a lot of parallels actually with India in terms of that vibrancy of the private sector. And in Shenzhen, we have a different approach. Obviously, we have the whole hardware manufacturing facilities there. And the very important company of Tencent, which is it's actually a bigger company than Alibaba, which is known for WeChat and recently bought Supercell, the gaming company. So a big player in games and in community. So actually Shenzhen and Hangzhou today, they really want to get into the core of what entrepreneurship is in technology. I think those are really the hotspots. And Beijing, of course, because the government needs to keep an eye on these entrepreneurs as they get bigger. Actually, Alibaba has close to 10,000 people working now in their Beijing office. But Beijing is more than just government. It is a center, of course, for education, culture. So those three really are the critical hotspots today. And within that, we're now seeing entrepreneurship spilling out far beyond the internet through e-commerce into whole aspects of society. Just think about ride sharing with Didi, which Apple recently put $1 billion into to compete and actually taking on very effectively Uber. So Alibaba and Tencent are also backing that venture. So you're seeing a very interesting kind of tidal wave going out from the internet into other parts of the economy, into finance, entertainment, transportation. So it really is transforming China before our eyes.
When we are looking at the subject of ambition as one of the big drivers for entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs, clearly Chinese companies, at least the large state-owned companies, have exhibited a sense of ambition to be dominant in their respective sectors globally. They are not just satisfied by being very large in China. They want global domination. And how do you see that in the private entrepreneurs?
Well, it's interesting. You can become a global leader just becoming a leader in China. So, given the scale of the market, look at Tencent. I mean, even before its acquisition of Supercell from SoftBank, it already, with its gaming business, was one of the largest in the world. So that's an interesting aspect of China. That, like the US, effectively, you can become a very serious global player just within your home market. But when they look beyond China, these are mindful of established incumbent US players. For example, here in Europe, the biggest internet companies by far are Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. So there isn't really much space for, say, a Chinese company to move in here and just take the market. Obviously, there is an opportunity to do that by acquisition, as we saw with Tencent into Finland and the Japanese business as well, Supercell. But this book is in English. Obviously, it's coming out in Chinese, but it's coming out in 15 languages now. Why? Because actually, where Alibaba is actually most popular as a business outside China is in emerging markets. So in Ukraine, in Russia, in Brazil, other parts of Latin America, and also in other parts of Asia. So all these places are locations where consumers are actually connecting with AliExpress and other websites under Alibaba. So I think what we're seeing is a south-south wave. So there are emerging market opportunities for companies from China in e-commerce, because China is the manufacturing workshop for the world, and who doesn't like factory prices? So whereas in the US, Alibaba is established but is more cautious. It's it's not really trying to disrupt Amazon, at least not now, because Amazon is very efficient. We have a very efficient offline retail sector in the US and efficient online. So there's really not much space. Where we see Alibaba and Tencent investing in the US is to back companies like Snapchat or Lyft or others that they might use to compete at home, or just to, frankly, make some money and learn about these companies overseas. So I think the China wave in e-commerce is certainly emerging markets. And there's another company called JD, which is a rival of Alibaba, which is also targeting that. Where they are targeting Alibaba the West is to bring brands. So approaching established luxury and other consumer brands in the West to connect those brands to consumers in China. So here in London, Alibaba has an office not far from here in Soho. They have offices in Paris, Milan, Munich. They're trying to go one step ahead of the competition, if you will, and bring Western products to the Chinese middle class revolution that is happening. So it's a pretty a cautious approach in terms of not trying to make big mistakes. Others have tried and failed. For example, Japanese companies like Rakuten failed, very strong in e-commerce in Japan, failed really in Europe and the US. So I think the Chinese have learned some of those lessons, but they are so big by their scale in China alone that they can become, they have a seat at the top table. I think it's going to be difficult for content companies like Baidu and others. We think about privacy and control. China obviously has its own firewalls and way of handling information. That doesn't really translate very well to, say, targeting the US consumer base. The US government, I don't think, would allow that. Also, consumers, I think, are concerned about privacy. Right or wrong, they have an impression that that's not who they won't go to China for their privacy.
Right. We're almost at the end of the session. My last question to you would be, in exuberant times with entrepreneurs all across the globe, you will notice that animal spirits tend to then start overplaying and overtaking everything else. So from a global perspective, where you are, what do you think, where are we in the balance right now? Is it clearly the animal instincts which are overtaking? Is it more greed? Or are we going to swing back to fear in some time? What's going on?
Well, you need both, right? I mean, the last chapter of my book is called Icon or Icarus. I mean, Jack Ma is already an icon, and there are others vying to come up in his wake in China. But there's also a risk in China. A very present risk is always the government, and how tolerant is the government of these very disruptive companies. And that's really a global issue. I mean, just think about the disruption that Uber has, had on transportation and taxis, and the relationships with government and those sectors, so healthcare, finance, you name it. So these are disruptive companies by nature. I mean, that's the point, right? So there's an element of ambition and greed in that, but there's also a resistance, a fear. And so, the role of these entrepreneurs increasingly is a negotiated transfer of power, ultimately, from incumbent companies, which might be state-owned or it might be multinationals, to a new way. And that doesn't happen overnight, but the technology is effectively happening overnight. Just think of Pokemon Go and what's happening right now. I can see people walking around, almost walking into manholes because they're looking at their phones. I mean, clearly this is disruptive, exciting stuff, but it does have profound implications. So I think fear and greed are two sides of the same coin, and it always will be. We just need to sell the coins, I guess.
Well, thank you so much, Duncan. Those were some great insights and some candid views on your book, on Jack Ma, on, if I can call it, the phenomenon of Alibaba and entrepreneurship in Asia and across the world. And thank you to our viewers for logging in. I see from across the world for this very exciting session. The house that Jack Ma built, as Duncan Clark mentioned, is going to be published in 15 languages. Do go out and buy a book. Thank you so much, Duncan.
Thanks. Have a great afternoon. Good luck with the festival.